Grace and peace to you this day. My question today would be, what is your favorite cross? You know, as a culture, we often wear necklaces or earrings and jewelry, and we put crosses on our walls and here in our sanctuaries and church buildings. What would your favorite one be? I've got a couple that I really enjoy to look at, but one of my absolute favorites is this one. See, it's a mosaic cross, right, made up of different tile pieces. It was a gift given to me by a dear friend named Meredith. Meredith and I, and a few others, joined us in a cohort for something called CPE, Clinical Pastoral Education, right? And so as part of my education to be a Lutheran pastor, I spent time as a chaplain. Most of us spend time in hospitals. And so I spent time learning about what it means to do ministry alongside people that are suffering. See, because people don't call the chaplain when things go great. It's not like, get the chaplain. See, people call the chaplain when things go bad. So we spend a lot of our time with people who are dying and their loved ones as they suffer and move towards that transition. See, this cross to me is special, not only because of who gave it to me, but also I think what it represents. See, in our gospel reading today, we hear about a cross and how Jesus declares, right? Anyone who would follow me should deny themselves and take up their cross. But what does that mean? See, the context of this quote from Jesus here in Matthew's gospel, right, is it picks up right after last week's text. See, last week we talked about Peter and how he had declared to Jesus, right, after Jesus had said or asked, who do you say that I am? Right, Peter ended up saying, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus, gives him a compliment, right, and says, that's wonderful, right? You get this from heaven, divine, because that's not the way human minds work, and all these different things, and says that you, right, on you I will build my church. See, but after this, right, it says that Jesus begins to teach them that what it means to be the Messiah is painful and it's suffering, right, and it involves a brokenness. You see, Jesus tells them that he's going to suffer. And he's going to suffer at the hands of the religious leaders, right, of the chief priests and the scribes, and eventually the government itself, right? Because we know how this story ends, right? That he will be killed, he will be executed by the government, right? In the form of capital punishment of the day, which is a cross and crucifixion. But he reminds them that he will be raised 3 days later. But that the path of the Messiah, right, the path that Jesus is to follow is one that leads to brokenness. It's one that leads to pain, suffering, and death. And then Jesus tells us that if we're to follow Jesus, we're to take up our own cross and follow. See, it's crazy, right? Because Jesus says this thing, right? Tells us to pick up a cross before we know that, crucifixion will be his fate. So I'm not sure what to do with that, but I don't think that we can interpret this without looking at how that story would unfold. It was written after these things took place, after Jesus was killed, and after he rose again. See, but the reason why I think this cross is so meaningful to me, right? See, this cross as a mosaic, right? As tiles that were broken and then formed into a cross is a reminder, I think, of what the cross actually is. It's a sign of brokenness. It's a sign of God's love in spite of such brokenness. See, Peter didn't get it, right? And I still think that we don't get it. See, in that time, it looked different, right? I mean, in that time, the Jewish people lived under Roman occupation, right? The Roman government was the empire that taxed them and oppressed them and imposed their rules with violence. But we see violence all over our world today and in our country and on the news. So maybe it's not that different, right? But Peter believed that Jesus was the Messiah, but it's obvious that the kind of Messiah that Jesus was telling them that he was going to be is not the kind of Messiah that Peter wanted, right? And probably not anybody, right? That's why Peter went to Jesus in our text, right? And says, don't say these things. This can't happen to you. And Jesus turns and rebukes him, right? He says, get behind me, Satan. For your mind is set on human things and not divine ones. At that point, Peter has become the deceiver, right? Peter has come to Jesus and offered him something different than God's mission for him and for the world, right? To take the easier way, right? See, Peter obviously wanted a warrior like Messiah, right? A king like David, perhaps, who would come in and kick out the Romans, right? If Israel is a playground, right? You just need a bigger bully to beat the current one. But that system of violence, right? That wheel of violence and injustice would just keep rolling and rolling and rolling. See, for Jesus to come in and to use violence and war and the methods and means of this world in order to save it, wouldn't be much of a saving at all, would it? And so what we see in Jesus, right, this declaration to follow Jesus, right, to know that Jesus' path ends at a cross, or as it seems to end there, means that we're called to that point as well. Just as Jesus, right, loved the world so much so that he was willing to be broken for it, that he was willing to lay down his life, right, to cast aside his privilege, his power, right, his status, and to put himself as a sacrifice, right, a broken being under the wheels of violence, because the wheels of violence, right, the power and privilege of this world, right, the systems that continue to profit off of the weak and the broken in our society can't fathom a love like Jesus. They can't fathom the idea that someone would be willing to stand alongside those who are under that wheel, those who are experiencing the unjust violence, persecution, and injustice. Someone would be willing to say, I love them and I'm willing to die for it. System can't figure that out. I think that's how the system gets broken, right? When we are tasked to follow Jesus into that life, to live as broken people, willing to be broken for those whom the world wants to break. People are hurting. People are scared. People feel like they can't breathe under the weight of this system of violence. As once again this week, another of our black brothers and sisters, right, Jacob Blake, was shot by police. And the world is crying out. What's our calling? Is it to take up our cross and follow Jesus, where would Jesus be standing? Well, we know that Jesus stands with the broken. Jesus is willing to have his own body broken and given so that all may be fed, nourished, and lift up. So I think when Jesus calls us to carry our cross, we're called to live lives like that. To live lives that are so willing to love and reach out to our neighbors that we're willing to be broken. To have the system squash us and hurt us and spit us out and look down on us and all those different things. That we're willing to stand up for those who Jesus stood up for. The outcast. Those experiencing injustice, those cast down by society, those treated unfairly, right? Those are the people that we're called to stand alongside because Jesus stands alongside them too. And so this cross reminds me, right? Because so often we see crosses that are so beautiful that they lose, right? They lose something about what the cross stands for. The cross is not some beautiful symbol to be worshiped and revered. The cross is a constant and ever-present reminder that the brokenness of the world cannot stand up to the love of God. That where injustice and oppression and racism and sexism and all these things are just present and soaking everywhere and standing there and so present you can feel it, right? Where all those things are, that's where Jesus is. That's where God plants the cross and says, this is not the end. There will be resurrection. There will be a time, there will be a moment where things turn around. The cross is completely opposite of this wheel of violence and oppression. As we carry our crosses, that, right, perhaps those crosses get stuck in the spokes of that wheel, and that wheel begins to break, and the world begins to change into the world that God has promised, into the world that Jesus is showing us over and over again as we read these stories about him. Stories about love and justice and including everyone. So we take up our crosses, knowing that the crosses that we take up can be broken in so many ways, just as we are, yet we stand there in solidarity with our brothers and sisters who need us, who are crying out for the justice that God promises us. We take our crosses there. We plant them firmly in the ground and say, this is not what God has intended. God's love is bigger than this. And let me show you, even if I get broken in the process. Amen.